So one of my main policies as your next mayor of London is education first. It's something that's really important to me, is the education of our children and making sure that we prioritize that. And that's why I was a bit alarmed this week to find out that 22% of secondary school students went missing this week. And that's actually up from 17% the previous month. And that was all because of fears of COVID. And what's happening in the schools is that 3/4 of them have now sent students home, all because they fear the COVID transmission. And my daughter's 16, and it's something they're constantly dealing with at her school. But the problem is this, is that none of this is based on science, and yet it's got all of the teachers and all of the schools stressed out and now under capacity because they're sending students home that are not sick. And when they've gone ahead and tested the students that were sent home, and again, you're told to self-isolate if you've had contact with someone who's tested positive, but you've got to self-isolate for 14 days. But it turns out that only 0.2% of those students sent home actually contracted the virus. 0.2%. So you're disrupting an entire quarter of the student population, and teachers go along with that for no reason, basically, because none of these students are positive, and yet we have this bad science, and again, this disproportionate response to the virus that has these arbitrary rules that say if one of the students tests positive, then everyone has to go home for 14 days. And the unfortunate thing is that this really affects the lower income and poorer students more, because a lot of times they don't have the access to technology and internet that's required to stay in touch remotely for their school. And again, that's one of the reasons I'm prioritizing my digital first policy here in London for free broadband access to all citizens. So we're not going to have that problem with that. But it just goes to show that we need more education and more science when it comes to our children and what's happening at schools. And I had Dr. Martin Kulldorff on my show recently from Harvard Medical School, and one of the authors of the great Barrington Declaration. We're going to have the Oxford professor on the show in the next couple weeks. And he said to me, he said, "Brian, it doesn't make sense to test anyone under 18. He said, because also we've shown that children don't spread the virus. They just don't spread it. He said, I don't even have a problem with younger children being around older people. It's the adults that seem to spread this virus. He said, the science shows us that. It shows us that there's 1,000-fold increase when it comes to vulnerability when you go from 7 years old to 70 years old. And yet no one's talking about this concept of focused protection, which he talks about. Again, all we hear from the current mayor of London is lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. Let's lock down the whole city. And this fear infects our school systems, and they send children home, and their education gets disrupted, and it's disruptive for the whole process. And then what's the point of having our education, which is the great equalizer, the greatest gift we can give all of our children? And these kids will be taking care of us one day. And so this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable when 22% of our secondary school students go missing, because then our schools are not back. It means that they're only offering at 70-some% of capacity and probably getting worse. What we need to do is use the science and listen to people like Dr. Martin Kulldorff and other scientists that can show us there's a way of doing focused protection, and not send a 10-year-old home for 2 weeks because one of his classmates tested positive, when later we find out that 0.2% of those actually had the virus. So again, back to the science, back to a proportionate response. Unfortunately, our politicians, including our prime minister and the current mayor of London, have this one-size-fits-all policy. You see this with the current mayor, where he says all 32 boroughs have to do the same thing. Even though where I'm located in Camden now, we have one of the lowest rates possible, where in Ealing they have a highest rate, and he says we all go as one. Again, not using the science, not using intelligence, but using some strange agenda that he might have for whatever reason. And again, I'm back to following the science. I'm also back to putting education first. So let's find a solution to this. Let's make sure that our students can go back to school and stay at school. Let's make sure we support the teachers as well by not sending them home when they don't have to be sent home. And so again, it's more about embracing the science and getting the information out there. Unfortunately, Science isn't something that seems to be embraced by our politicians, and I'd like to change all of that as your next mayor of London. So thank you so much. Please leave your comments below. Tell me if you think we should be sending our children home for these reasons when they're not showing this infection rate. Tell me if you think we should embrace the science and use a proportional response to the virus. Again, we need new leadership that can actually have these conversations. The top scientists in the world are saying this, and yet our politicians can't engage with that. That doesn't make sense to me. That's why I want to take London in a new direction.